These are the texts from the Common Lectionary, which will be used in many churches, including our own here at First Presbyterian in Beaufort, on October the 8th. I say these texts will be used, one or more of them will be used on October the 8th. Not that it's necessary for us in the Presbyterian tradition to use them, it's just oftentimes that is what ministers choose to use. Some of us consider it to be a good discipline because then we don't preach on all of our pet texts all the time. Others of us don't like the idea at all, and we're free to do whatever we would like. Nevertheless, here are the texts. The first one is Exodus, the 20th chapter. Now, for some of you, you may be thinking already, that sounds like something I might know. Well, you might know this. It is one of the two areas where the Ten Commandments are listed out. The other is in early Deuteronomy, and it's worth looking around both of those to see how they're the same and how they are different. But we're just taking up the Exodus text today, so I'll just talk about its particular context. The children of Israel have arrived at Sinai, Mount Sinai, around chapter 19. And so from chapter 19 through chapter 23, you might call it the true formation of the Hebrew people, of the Hebrew nation, the true formation of the Hebrew nation. This is where their code of laws, including the Ten Commandments and other law, is handed down. This is where the covenant becomes clear, and it's no clearer than it is today in our text. Listen to how the text begins, verse 2 of chapter 20. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So before this very first commandment of no other gods before me, we already have the context set in which the children of Israel are now a people. It is God's initiative. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. In other words, your salvation is now complete in this. And now I invite you to participate with me in this covenant that I have created. So it's not like God is saying, if you do this, then I'm going to do this. I have done it. And that puts the rescue out of Egypt in the starkest possible terms. The people were in no place to help themselves. And then their God does all of the heavy lifting. Now let's look at the commandments here in particular for just a second. I've been outside. I didn't realize I still had my sunglasses with me. The commandments in particular for just a second. I rather tend to divide them into two sections. The first four and the last six, I would say. Definitely the first three and the last six. There's one that sort of blends in between the two. I'm not quite sure where to put it. I tend to put it with the first group, but it's you can weigh that for yourself and see where you would like to put it. This first one, you shall have no other gods before me. Now listen carefully to that language. This doesn't say, I am the only God. You shall have no other gods above me. I'm number one. Now, that throws some people, but it's worth remembering that God is a God of history and God works with people where they are, their context. Now think of the context of the children of Israel. Apart from that singular commandment or that singular covenant with Abraham, hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, Abraham, go from your homeland to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And occasionally that promise came back to Abraham, but it was never as though Abraham was going to live there, but it would be to his generations to come at some point. That was the whole covenant. Again, God's initiative, but that was the whole covenant. Now what we have is these children of Israel in this place, and the covenant is getting fleshed out. I'm the one who rescued you, just the same as I'm the one who gave that promise to Abraham. And now I'm number one. Through all these hundreds of years in Egypt, with all of these gods and this predominant culture, we cannot think for a moment that these Israelites were not influenced by that. They certainly were influenced by that, just the same way you and I are influenced by the culture in which we live. So God worked with them where they are. You shall have no other gods before me. Then the second commandment is quite similar. Now the New Revised Standard says you'll make no idols. That really is an interpretation, I think, and not a translation. I wish it had kept with the translation. I think it would have helped us to appreciate where those people were at their time. You shall make no graven images is what the translation probably should have said. And when you think about what all the ancient cultures did, they took some things to symbolize elements of nature and they made gods out of those. And other things they did, they created mythological looking beasts that became gods. And so this was God's way with the graven image notion to discourage the people from fashioning anything that they might determine, this has real potency. We better pay it homage in order to gain whatever it can give us to gain. And so he just says, no graven images. Again, working with the people where they are. Then on down about the Sabbath. And in this section, which is a fun one to compare to where the Ten Commandments come out in Deuteronomy, in this section, the Sabbath has to do, or keeping a Sabbath, with the Lord working for 6 days and resting on the seventh. So look over in Deuteronomy and see that the justification for keeping the Sabbath day holy is a little bit different than that. Then comes the one that I'm not sure where to put it, which is why I hesitated earlier, the honor your father and mother. For some reason, I tend to link that one more with the commandments about God and less with the commandments about community. But on another day, I might link them more with the ones that follow about community. So put it where you like, and you may have an idea one way or the other about it. The rest of them are clearly about community. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, and you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, I'm just going to make one blanket comment about that. I've heard people say before that, the commandments are all about, you can't do this and you can't do that, as though they're all restrictive. Well, here's the way I have always thought about the commandments. Would the world be a better place if there were more murder instead of you shall not murder, if there were more adultery, more stealing, more bearing false witness, which, by the way, means don't perjure yourself. If you're in conflict with your neighbor and you go to court, don't lie in court. And would the world be a better place if there was more covetousness of one neighbor toward another? You see the point. These aren't really prohibitions. These are guidelines so that we can find the happiest possible way to live together in community. So the commandments are all about the formation of relation with God and the formation of community one with another. It provides for productive life as opposed to being restrictive. There really is no freedom without some kinds of structures around it. One example, and then I'll move on to another text. Imagine if football or basketball or baseball had no rules, no lines on the field, no out of bounds lines, anything goes. It would break down into utter chaos. But within the rules, there's enormous freedom to be creative, so that no two football teams or basketball teams or baseball teams are alike in how they approach the game. The freedom is found within the confines of the rules. So it is for us, and so it is with these texts from the book of Exodus. The second text is a psalm. It's Psalm 19, and I'll be short with it. It celebrates the goodness of the law, and in fact, at one place it says it is sweeter than honey. Now, think about it like this: is this not a true celebration of how wonderful the law allows us to live before God and with each other when we respond to God's grace? Yeah. And so that's why the psalmist, I think, waxes eloquent and gets to the point of the law is sweeter than honey. Our minister at First Presbyterian Beaufort, and for those of you that are just joining in, by the way, I too am a minister, but I'm retired, so I could say our minister, being the one that is the pastor at First Presbyterian Beaufort, often uses the alternate Old Testament text. I have tended to use in my career the semi-continuous one, which would have been from Exodus. We've been working from Genesis into several passages through Exodus and so on, chronologically through the people of Israel. He tends to use the alternate one, which is not a semi-continuous chronological account. Perfectly fine. And the one that he's apt to include in worship will be from Isaiah chapter 5, 1 through 7. Chapter 5, 1 through 7 is a piece of poetry from Isaiah about a vineyard. Now, whenever Israelites hear the word vineyard, they know it's about them. In the same way, in the appropriate context, and I can't figure the right context at the moment, if we were to think of the bald eagle, we might think of the United States. So whenever the Israelites hear vineyard, they know that whatever's being talked about is about them. Isaiah couches it as his beloved establishing a vineyard. His beloved being God establishes a vineyard, and he fertilizes and he tends it and takes care of it, and on and on and on. But it only yields wild grapes. I'm guessing that means grapes that are too small or grapes that are bitter and very, very sour. Hold on to the vineyard notion, because when we get to the parable of Jesus today, Jesus is going to speak of the vineyard too, and those first hearers will know immediately he's speaking of the Israelites or the Hebrews in that time. Let's move on now, and we'll go to the text in Philippians. We've been reading through Philippians a little bit too. A couple of weeks ago, in my class at First Church Beaufort, one of the persons in the class said she had read through all of Philippians at one sitting for the first time ever, and found it to be such an uplifting book. Well, by and large it is. But in today's text, Paul is bringing the hammer down. It is in chapter 3, and we know there's a shift when Paul says, finally, to begin chapter 3. Then Paul says in verse 2, and although that's a couple verses ahead, let me look at my notes, a couple of verses ahead of where we actually start, it truly sets up the context in which Paul's main message is going to come. But verse 2 says, beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh. Now, mutilate the flesh, he's referring to circumcision. Paul has been circumcised. All of the Hebrews who are part of the covenant have been circumcised. Most Hebrew Christians were circumcised as well. But he's relating those people with dogs and evil doers or evil workers. He usually reserves the word worker for in the church. So I'm certain that he means those in the church who are insisting on a code of conduct that is above and beyond what Paul believes is important in the life of the Christian community. You see, by this time, there are Jewish Christians and there are Gentile Christians. And there is a pocket of Jewish Christians, I won't say all of them, but a pocket, that are adamant that every other Christian obey the dietary laws, obey the laws about circumcision, obey the laws about dedication in the temple, all of the things that made a good Jew a good Jew. And Paul is trying to let people know that's not the case, because that begins to imply that it's our initiative that puts us in relation with Christ, not Christ's initiative. And so Paul's argument, after beware of all of this, Paul picks up and says, if anyone has reason to be confident in the flesh, and this time he uses flesh more than just circumcision, but the movement, the activity of human life, if anyone has confidence, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day. You might even add, like a good Jew. I'm a member of the people of Israel, like all of the best Jews, because there were Jews that lived outside of Israel. I was born in the tribe of Benjamin. The first king, Saul, came from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law of Pharisee, in other words, I know and have mastered all of the law and can probably speak it all by heart, and so forth. What Paul is trying to say is, I'm better than all the rest of you in terms of those kinds of obedience. But then he says, whatever gains I had, I count as loss because of Christ. He goes on to say, it is in knowing Christ that everything else evaporates. By knowing Christ, by having the experience of Christ, nothing else is as important. Maybe nothing else is even important at all. Paul recognizes what we learned early in Exodus, that it is God's initiative, and for Christians, God's initiative in Christ that sets up and creates our capacity to live with Christ or to live with God. And so that's where Paul's going with this. It concerns him greatly when people think they can earn their way before God. Lastly, we have the text from the book of Matthew in the 21st chapter. Last week we picked up one of those parables, the first of 3 parables, during the controversy and conflict that Jesus is having in Jerusalem with the religious leaders. Last week we talked about that. By whose authority do you preach? And now Jesus told them a parable then. And now a second parable. And he speaks about a landowner who planted a vineyard. And he talks about how he built a fence, dug the well, made it watered, and so forth, hired tenants to keep it for him, and now it's time for the harvest. And so he sends his own servants to collect the harvest from the tenants, and they beat up one of the servants, and they murder the other servant. Now, remember, the religious leaders listening to this already know he is linking the vineyard with the people of God, the people of Israel, the Hebrew nation. They've got to be wondering, who are these tenants that he's talking about? And then, who are they beating up? The implication seems to be that those that they have either beaten or killed are the prophets that God has sent over time, God being the landowner of the people of the vineyard. And then the last person that the landowner sends is his own son. And the tenants kill him and throw his body outside the garden. Matthew includes another piece, another section of Scripture from the Old Testament here. He frames it in Jesus' own words by saying, have you never read in the Scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing. And Matthew understands that with these words, Jesus is referring to himself. Now, it doesn't really seem to fit with the parable, except that this is Matthew's way of linking the key cog in the relationship between God and God's people, the cornerstone, Jesus, the Son, whom the scribes and the Pharisees and the other religious leaders are about to kill. I know they don't quite fit together, and maybe we could take on Matthew and say, Matthew, you've clearly pulled this from the Old Testament, and probably this wasn't the right place to insert that. But for Matthew, it was the right place, and I think we can see both the link and the split between how these really don't fit all that well together. The point of the whole thing is Jesus warning the people of God. You know, God sent prophets to you. God has now sent God's own Son to you. And you're about to be rejected as the messengers of God because of your behavior. Now, hold that message into its historic context. And now we ask the question, what does that mean to us? God has called us together as God's people, as Christians. God has provided for us the Word. God has provided for us ample opportunity to develop a harvest. What does God find when He looks at the Christian church? Is God finding that we are responding to God's goodness with an appropriate harvest or not? I think that is always an open-ended question, and always the way that you and I, as part of the people of God, need to evaluate our own lives and evaluate the lives of the Christian community as well. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to this again with you next week.